Welcome to North Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host and producer. My name is James Spagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, I feel like the Raiders won that game twice.
They won the game twice and lost it once. So net one win, which works out in the standings at least.
Yeah, that was that. I know you were watching it. I was watching the same channel that you were, because we were both watching the Eli and Peyton show, and watching Peyton Manning just lose his mind over that last fumble.
Yeah. Oh my. Well, I mean, it's so obvious, and Tony Romo kind of used to do this too, although he's now more of a professional broadcaster than before. Like, he was always really polished, which is very impressive. But Peyton is like so very clearly cheering for the offense, like no matter what. That like when the offense makes a mistake, regardless of the team, he's just had it. Or like when Carr took that sack from Owa, like just absolutely, he wanted to wring Derek Carr's neck. Like, incredible stuff.
And his hatred of sound on the field while your offense is out there.
Yeah, like because Ray Lewis was saying that, like, yeah, you know, we soon learned that Omaha didn't mean anything, and then Peyton Manning went off. I assume because at some point Omaha meant something, and then he's like, yeah, I mean, they always know, you know, what plays. We work on this, all week. We've got like our own secret plans, and then they just kind of put it out there. It's kind of the same energy of that one reporter who was like trying to cover Donald Trump, like some scandal or whatever that is something illegal that Trump did, and then Trump, tweets out that he's doing this thing that is definitely illegal, and the reporter was just like, "Man, I've been working on that story for months of research, digging down sources, confirming 2-3 times, making sure I've got all my facts," and he just tweets it out. Is the exact same energy of Peyton Manning just being like, "We worked on this all week," and the broadcast just picks it up. They just send it out. And then you talk about Ray Lewis, like they would call a play and then Ray Lewis would be like, "All right, it's a zone run to the right." And he's just like, God damn. It was great. It was a great broadcast. And I think, so like, Tony Romo is a very traditional color commentator that just happens to have a very recent experience with the game and very knowledgeable, base of which to draw from, and an ability to communicate all that effectively. Really great for him as a traditional broadcaster, which is fantastic. But like, Peyton Manning is not really polished. He's like interrupting the play to tell a story, or he's interrupting stories to talk about the play. Fine, whatever. But he's got all these funny stories he wants to tell, and he just tells them. And I really like his lack of polish. It's very like characteristic. And I think it's kind of in between what Romo does as a color commentator and what you get from like the CFB national championship game. We've got the coaches room. They've like 4 to 8 coaches in a room, and they talk about the national championship game. And there's a lot of really great stuff to pick up, but they don't really have an enormous amount of chemistry. Sometimes they'll have digs at each other, which are fun. They'll break down the game in a ton of detail, but it is kind of dry and it's harder to follow along. And I think Peyton kind of hit, I say Peyton, Eli was there too, and he was pretty funny, and that interaction was good, but it was clearly like Peyton was talking 5 times as much as Eli. But Peyton like found a great middle ground where he could kind of teach you about the game, tell some good stories, have a lot of fun, but not really feel like it feels like you're listening in on a conversation and he knows you are, instead of listening to a broadcast, which is what Tony Romo was doing. So I really enjoyed that. And man, all the times that the Manning brothers like just needled each other was fantastic. Like Eli Manning saying, like, "Would you rather have $10,000 or Peyton's helmet full of quarters?" Like, oh my God. Incredible stuff.
I liked the comment that Peyton had made to Russell Wilson about how Sierra's got a ring of his that he really wished he could get. He could have back.
Yeah, right. That was so good.
Like, Russ is just sitting there smiling, like, "Yeah, you got pretty destroyed that game." Well, welcome to this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys are all doing well. We have a game to review today, which is different. We are finally in the regular season, so you're getting two episodes of Norse Code this week. You're getting today's show, and then you're going to be getting the one that posts right after the Thursday night game. So enjoy it. We're back into regular season form. We got our two shows, and we are back to talking about our Patreon. If you'd like to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode, and you can donate there. $3.50 per month does get you the bonus episodes. Just want to thank two people in particular. Kurt Sterling, thank you so much for signing up over at Patreon this week. Also, Ron, who is also signed up over at Patreon. Thank you so much. Again, all this helps just keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay, helps pay for everything in the way of machines and software and mics and just being able to put out a twice a week show. So you guys get a bunch of bonus material. You'll get a bonus episode here probably in the next couple of days as well, just with discussions with Arif and I. So enjoy. Thank you guys so much. We really do appreciate it. Other ways to support the show include just going to paypal.me/NorseCode as well. That's for a one-time donation. Also, you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and go over to the collections and check out t-shirts and everything. Don from Ohio went out of his way this weekend rather, to model a shirt, and I had made some comment about it, and it turned out that was actually successful because we got like a sale immediately after the picture of the shirt went up. So I'm uncomfortable with Don being the model for our like logos and things, but
it's a low budget operation, James. We got to take what we can.
Yeah, that is boy, if there's ever been an understatement, that is certainly it. So again, thanks to everyone who supported the show.
If you would like to be the model, simply buy a shirt from our merch store and then tweet out a picture of you wearing it, and there's like a pretty good, like a 90% chance that you would replace Don.
Yes,
as the model.
Don's bathroom really does need a splash of color.
Right.
That was it felt a bit like the scene from The Simpsons where Lenny's house like partially caved in and he's sitting in his boxers eating like cold beans from a can in a like a it's like, please don't tell people how I live. Like, there was a bit of that. So, again, thank you guys so much. Or if you'd like to support the show, just tell a friend, tell a coworker, tell somebody about Norse Code. We really do appreciate all the listens. Thank you guys so much. And let's get into this episode of Norse Code, because this was a loss. This was a loss to the Bengals. There were a number of things that went wrong and went wrong immediately. There's a bunch of stuff that happened at the end that was kind of questionable. But what I want to do now, what Norse Code wants to do right now, is to provide you, the listener, with fodder to talk with your friends, to talk with your coworkers about the game, and we're just going to help you provide with a little bit of ammo. So I've got 3 questions for Arif as to why this was the reason that the Vikings lost. And we're going to start with the refs. Why were the refs the reason why the Vikings lost?
I mean, of course, the refs were the reasons that they lost. I mean, you take a look. They got over 90 penalty yards. The Vikings were more efficient on offense. They were more efficient on defense. They did a much better job, moving the ball. But the Vikings ended up facing, 3rd and long so many times, and some pretty key plays in the game. The fumble, the Jefferson touchdown, although that drive still ended in a touchdown, it would have taken a little bit less time. A couple of key plays that the refs just simply got wrong. And it put the Vikings in a bad spot. I mean, it's people always talk about, hey, you've got to play well enough so that the refs can't decide the outcome. But the reality of the NFL is you simply can't, and that it's not actually asking for all that much for the scales to be fair. Because if the refs are biased for one team or the other, and that team is, say, an NFL average team, they end up with like a 10-6 record or a 10-7 record, and they end up going to the playoffs, even though they shouldn't have made it, because an above average team was made into an average team because of the refs. So, these kinds of mistakes, you just can't have that in an NFL product.
All right, so let's go to another one. Arif, why was Kirk Cousins the reason why the Vikings lost the game, despite the fact that he was the highest rated player on the Vikings from PFF?
Yeah, I can't believe people think the refs are the reason that the Vikings lost this game. It's obviously Kirk Cousins. I mean, you take a look at, the halftime comments from Zimmer are just a really great, piece of evidence to support this. I mean, Kirk Cousins was holding onto the ball way too long, and people talk about these holding penalties, right? But obviously, there wouldn't be nearly as many holding penalties. I mean, half of them, which there were at least enough where you could say half of them and have a meaningful number left, were because Cousins continued to hold on to the ball well after he should have gotten rid of it. He wasn't getting rid of the ball out on time. He wasn't getting rid of the ball at the break. And, you don't ever have that moment in the first three quarters where he puts the game away. Now, obviously, he ends up kind of leading this drive that brings the Vikings to comeback territory. But he never really gets the Vikings into a spot where they can effectively manage that clock and win the game. I mean, he's thrown to the middle of the field in the final 2 minutes. The Vikings are hurrying up, and it's nice to finally see urgency. But the reason they have to have so much urgency is because Cousins keeps throwing these passes that take time off the clock. And so he wasn't able to really help the Vikings manage the clock situation in a way that allows them to end the game with a win. It's obviously Kirk Cousins' fault, even if he ends up with a really great yards per attempt or a really high PFF grade or whatever. And there were plays where, Justin Jefferson's wide open for a touchdown in the seam between two safeties, and he misses him. And it's Justin Jefferson's your best player. Why not throw to him?
All right, let's go to our final one. Why was Zimmer/Kubiak the reason why the Vikings lost the game?
Good Lord. Kirk Cousins finally has an amazing fourth quarter, plays in the clutch better than he ever played over the course of the entire game, and we still turn on him, despite that being the biggest knock. Incredible. Kirk Cousins rose to the occasion, moved the ball down the field, despite the fact that, the Vikings kept calling these plays that, with all these 7-step drops. I mean, when is the last time we've seen 7-step drops from the Vikings? It was Norv Turner and Teddy Bridgewater, who at the time led the league in time to throw, because all of these deep drops, you talk about Kirk Cousins not getting rid of the ball out on time. It's like, well, these receivers are running routes that have to take another second or two in order to develop. And in the modern NFL, that's just not going to work. And then Zimmer, wasting all the timeouts, the early timeout in the third quarter, plus that challenge. And look, honestly, I understand people talk about this challenge like, hey, Justin Jefferson should have gotten it in. But you should realize that the refs are always going to default to the call in the field unless there's incontrovertible evidence, otherwise. And the Vikings are probably just going to score from the one. I mean, that's just obvious. Wasting a challenge and then wasting a timeout, that's what ruins your ability to manage the clock effectively. I mean, Kirk Cousins ends up running a play. It doesn't spike the ball. He runs a play at the at midfield. That ends up being an incompletion. If the Vikings were able to call a timeout there, which they didn't have, they would have been able to call in the right play. Not that, Kubiak would have been able to call in the right play, because he keeps on calling all of these plays where you've got receivers running away from the sideline in the 2-minute drill. Absolutely nuts. No way you can effectively manage a game if you're Kirk Cousins without the routes to get you there, especially when you know that Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen are deep threats despite whatever their 40 times tell you, and you don't really have them running that many deep routes. Ridiculous.
That might be my favorite segment of the year, by the way. That was awesome. Let's talk about it, because there's plenty of blame to go around. But obviously the first thing that is on everyone's mind, and the first thing that happened in the game, were the penalties. This was a line that couldn't be set. This was a line that was constantly jumping. I pride myself on my love and devotion to Captain CJ Ham, and Ham was a major problem out there. So what was going on with the ridiculous amount of penalties?
That was pretty crazy. So putting the bit aside that we just had, which I'm pretty proud of, I didn't actually prep that. But putting that bit aside, the penalty is obviously a huge problem. I forget, because I remember there were 11 penalties at the half, and then I didn't end up looking by the end of the game how many there were.
12 accepted.
12 accepted. So was that 14 total penalties then?
I think it was either 15 or 16 total. 12 accepted. Yeah,
I think 2 offensive penalties were declined, and 1 defensive penalty was declined because it occurred at the same time as another defensive penalty. Nuts. I remember trying to look up way back when the Raiders were the most penalized team in the league by a country mile. They had a game with 17 penalties, and people were scrambling to find out if that was the most in a game. And I remember almost getting to that point, but then the second half, you just didn't have that many relative to the first half. But yeah, CJ Ham had 2 false start penalties, one when he was moving laterally, and the other one, of course, when he was moving off the line of scrimmage. That was kind of Ham was actually was only okay as a blocker in this game. I think he's like a top 3 blocker as a fullback. Not that that's like a crowded field to work with, but that was an issue. Obviously, like every member of the offensive line got penalized. We almost got a holding penalty for each individual offensive lineman, but we did not get one from Brian O'Neill. I believe we didn't get a holding penalty from him. I think we got a false start from him and an illegal formation from him. But we got, I want to say 2 penalties in Oli Udo. I think one was a holding, one was a false start. At least one on Ezra Cleveland. At least one, maybe 2 on Rashad Hill. And a holding penalty for sure on Garrett Bradbury. Although I didn't like that holding penalty on Bradbury. Not that he has like another set of plays from the game where he was secretly good. I mean, he was just consistently pretty bad. But that one just looked like he was torquing an offensive lineman and pancaked him. So I don't know if that, but like complaining about one ticky-tack penalty call out of like the 13 or 14 that ended up getting called. I mean, that's just, what are you really negotiating with? The Vikings were pretty undisciplined. Whenever there's a game with a lot of penalties, I think this like comes up where people talk about Zimmer and his inability to get the team prepped for that. And this doesn't happen a lot. So maybe I'm just kind of responding to 1 or 2 people, but, there was a time, 2014, 2015, maybe into 2016, where the Vikings were like the least or second least penalized team in the league. And people were talking about how Zimmer was so good for that, especially because, Xavier Rhodes in 2013 was incredibly penalized. And so him coming in and kind of fixing that was seen as kind of like a sign of him being able to kind of instill discipline in a team. I don't think that this will necessarily follow going forward, but it is very weird if it was like we didn't have a preseason and then we immediately went into games with a crowd, right? Which that's a difficult scenario to imagine where they would cancel the preseason, but you'd still allow crowds at games. You'd understand it, right? But they have a preseason game against the Chiefs. They play a bunch of noise at practices. And, I've been to practices where they play the crowd noise, and I can tell you it's like kind of loud. It's not as loud as like a lot of these loud stadiums get. But I will say, I don't think the Bengals stadium was that loud. I mean, you see like 6 or 5 false starts and you think, it must be loud. I don't think that was the case for me being there. And I don't want to like say Bengals fans are secretly bad fans or anything like that. I've been in some really loud friggin' stadiums, and that was not that loud relative to some of the other loud stadiums. I think the Vikings, for whatever reason, were just not prepared for it, which was just very, very weird. And I don't think they had their silent count worked out correctly or something like that. So obviously they'll work on that because they're on the road next week. But that was a huge issue. The holding penalties, I think some of that, and maybe the false starts, some of that might have to do with a weird transition the Vikings made with offensive line coach. I couldn't tell you exactly how, but if there's like a slight difference in the way that they want to coach technique, or if, and maybe not even want to, maybe it's just that because they coach differently, the players absorb the technical coaching a little bit differently, and maybe the hands become a little bit outside as a result of the coaching. And the further outside the hands are, the more likely it is that the ref are going to see holding outside of your frame. And that's what actually gets called, because there's holding on every play, but it's the noticeable holding, which tends to be stuff that is moving against the flow of the play, or stuff that is, clearly, keeping someone out of, in check outside of their frame. That's the stuff that gets called. And so I wonder if, that kind of abrupt coaching change, because Phil Rafter took over for Rico Dennison, who refused to get the vaccine. And that's just a really difficult, you can't have a tier 2 coach because they can't interact with the players. That was just a difficult situation to work out. So I wonder if that plays a role in all the holding penalties. And Zimmer made an interesting point that like it was surprising, because most of the time, if he sees penalties called fairly often early in the season, they were penalties that showed up in like the preseason or like in practices, right? Because they bring NFL refs to practices, and the NFL refs are supposed to call it like they call it on the field. And at least in training camp, not like practice, but training camp. And there weren't holdings or false starts, really. So that was kind of interesting that kind of wasn't there. The holding penalties might be the coaching change. It could just be that they were kind of not that talented, and they were trying to, keep up for their lack of talent. Or it could be, just kind of random. Maybe that crew calls a lot more holding than usual. I mean, they didn't call the Bengals, I guess, but maybe, I don't know. But this seems like an issue that historically for the Vikings and historically across the NFL does tend to, not always, but does tend to get fixed. I was going to say work itself out. From the perspective of fans, I guess it works itself out because we don't have any control of the situation. But teams will pay particular attention usually to that after kind of a spate of penalties. So that, I think, going forward is going to be significantly less of an issue, which, like, I know it's not a bold claim to say the Vikings will probably not get penalized 14 times in their next game, but, I'm still kind of sticking it out there on that one.
Like, I'm not willing to put my entire reputation on this. I am saying, however...
Right.
Well, let's talk about the next thing that was really noticeable, which was the O-line. And there was it's hard to talk about the O-line and not talk about the penalties, but this did appear to be again more of a makeshift thing. And Cousins occasionally had time, but still, this didn't, for as much talk as people have had over the last 6 months about how this was going to end up being something, how this line was actually going to be able to protect Cousins, was going to be able to run block, was going to be able to do things. Boy, did it not look together.
So this is kind of interesting. I was kind of playing around with this earlier today because I was trying to figure out if I wanted to write a piece on the defensive line or the offensive line. And so I was trying to see who was more pressured between the two, right? Was it Kirk Cousins or Joe Burrow? And out of the 31 quarterbacks that had at least 10 dropbacks, or I guess 8 dropbacks, where do you think Cousins ranked in pressure percentage? Yes. Yeah. So so obviously the 2 quarterbacks have not been graded yet by PFF, but out of 31 quarterbacks, number 1 being the most pressured quarterback, in the weekend, and 31 being the least. Who do you think was? Where do you think Cousins ranked?
As far as his pressures, it seemed like he was constantly under pressure. So I want to say that he was somewhere in the top third.
No, he ranked dead middle. He was 18th, or not dead middle, but like in the middle at 18th. Joe Burrow was actually pressured very slightly more, just as a percentage, probably just because of the way. Like it was like 34% to 33%. Yeah, and obviously, that's the way Pro Football Focus measures pressures. There's at least one pressure on Burrow that I think should count as a pressure. I think it would count as a win in terms of defensive line win rate at the very beginning of the game. That's not counted as a pressure against Burrow. But yeah, and Cousins actually got rid of the ball in 2.43 seconds, identical to Joe Burrow, at least on average. So it's just on Cousins' sacks and on some of the scrambles, kind of scrambles. Cousins, you never really have scrambles. It was not necessarily, like, aside from those, it was not necessarily all that long. And that feels weird, right? Because you remember him holding onto the ball, you remember him moving around, you remember a penalty getting called when he's getting hit as something is thrown. And maybe part of it is that Pro Football Focus doesn't call plays that where someone is penalized as a pressure, in which case, that kind of reduces a lot of it because a lot of those pressures occurred on what are functionally dead plays. But honestly, I think that our perception of the game is kind of a little bit out of whack because we remember these big moments. I think if the Vikings had won, if Dalvin Cook doesn't fumble it and they run it 12 more yards and get the kick and win the game, we probably would be talking about the events of the previous 4 quarters differently. It's very weird. So there's that. The offensive line, when it wasn't committing penalties, was okay. I mean, except for Garrett Bradbury, was okay. Like Garrett Bradbury got beat up. Ezra Cleveland, lost some pretty significant snaps that are pretty memorable. But, on an aggregate basis, it's a very difficult thing to say because it feels like I'm about to get booed and get a bunch of tomatoes thrown at me. But on an aggregate basis, the offensive line kind of did okay if you remove the penalties. Hopefully there's enough ifs and thens that people don't feel that upset.
Yeah, if only there weren't 10 offensive penalties by the line.
Yeah, that I would say that like plays a role in our evaluation of what they did. But if we wanted to talk just about their pass blocking capability, well, first Brown and Neal did really well, so that's nice to see. Aside from like the illegal formation and the false start, which are not technically pass blocking penalties, so great. But I thought Rashad Hill, when he wasn't holding, did okay. I thought, I mean, Oli Udoh, I thought did all right. Again, when he wasn't holding, I thought that he did a fairly decent job. Garrett Bradbury, that there's like work to be done there. Ezra Cleveland, work to be done. Less work than Bradbury, but work to be done there. But yeah, this was a more of a mixed to positive performance from the offensive line on plays where they weren't committing penalties.
Well, let's talk about the offense then, and let's talk about the passes specifically by Kirk Cousins and his dump offs, because on Twitter they had put out the stat sheet as to where his target sheet really as to where he was passing them out, and were there more than two passes that were beyond 17 yards? Maybe 3 passes. This was this was a study in dump offs.
Yeah, well, especially for the first 3 quarters. In the first 3 quarters, Cousins had an average depth of target of 5.6, which is basically over the course of an entire year, it's the bottom of the league. After that, it was still pretty low, but it was closer to within the range that you'd expect most quarterbacks to be. I think like something like 7.5. I did the math on like a piece of paper that I think I left at the stadium, so I'm going to have to do it again. But there were not, especially again in those first 3 quarters, there were just not that many attempts deep downfield, which is weird given how many third and longs there were. And this is the thing that's like kind of really difficult to parse in terms of like, we always talk about how, Cousins, racks up these statistics and maybe they're not really a good indication of how good a quarterback he is. If you were to design a game that would look like the quarterback is doing really well in a lot of statistics, but is not doing well on the field, you would either design a game where they get blown out early and the quarterback has to throw a bunch to pass up, to catch up, like, the week 2 against the Packers last year, week 1, week 2. Or you would design a game where they're constantly at 3rd and 20 and, Cousins completes a 15-yard pass. Like, well, that raises your yards per attempt from like 7 to 8, depending on how many attempts you've had thus far. But it doesn't like get you what you need, which is a first down. Which, admittedly, first down on 3rd and 20 is kind of difficult to do, but it does make your statistics look a lot better. So I'm taking a look at PFF's chart. They actually have 3 passes over 20 yards from their passing chart, which is actually the same as Joe Burrow. The difference is that Cousins was a 27-yarder and Joe Burrow's was a 50-yard touchdown. So that kind of changes our perception of it. But yeah, and the thing is, of having 3 passes over 20 yards for Burrow is a higher proportion of the passes that they had because Cousins dropped back to pass like 49 times, right? Or 52 times, but 49 attempts. So yeah, there were a lot below 10 yards. Let me add this up real quick. It's 26 below 10 yards ahead of the line of scrimmage, and then another 7 behind the line of scrimmage. Yep. So
it really did feel like the exact same thing that we saw in the preseason that we were complaining about then and we can complain about now. Like, it almost seemed like he's not looking. Like, and maybe he's got the Jameis Winston situation where now he needs glasses, or now he needs the surgery to be able to see Justin Jefferson alone out there. But it really looked like all he wanted to do was just dump off.
Yeah, and I think that, and this is like such a weird game to have a discussion about Cousins, because in that final quarter and in overtime, he was doing so well. But if he had done well enough in the first 3 quarters, he wouldn't have needed to do so well in the 4th quarter and overtime, right? Which kind of contributes to this discussion overall that we have about, whether or not quarterbacks are clutch or whatever, right? Yeah, it's if he had taken advantage of some of the opportunities that showed up, and mind you, Justin Jefferson, he has a drop, he loses 2 contested catches. Like, you need the receivers to do a little bit more. I mean, this is kind of a frustrating game, for people, that are fans of Justin Jefferson. But like, Also, Cousins was passing up opportunities that existed kind of in the intermediate to deep range that he really could have taken advantage of. It was a really short depth of target. It was significantly below the NFL average. So, yeah, there are elements of this game where you can say that if Cousins had done this or Cousins had done that, and of course the game ends in an overtime, which means that basically any play changes, and you could say that that's the reason that they lost. Like if Justin Jefferson holds onto the ball, or if he reaches out a little bit more, or whatever, right? If he catches some of these passes that are dropped or contested, maybe you could say that would have been the difference, right? So it's not as if you can only point to one element, because it would be equally true for a lot of elements, but they wouldn't have needed Cousins to kind of ramp things up in the fourth quarter if he had been a little bit more aggressive in the first three quarters. And from my eyes, watching at the game, and this is something I would want to confirm with the All-22, were it ever made available.
Once the NFL gods are blessing you with that again.
Right. I would love to be able to confirm that, because it's not systematic when I'm watching it live, right? But I thought that there were some pretty big missed opportunities from Cousins, further down the field. Although, like, there is a play calling element. Like when I was doing the bit, there was a play calling element where I think that they weren't doing enough to attack the deep sidelines when the Bengals were doing cover 3 type stuff. Because I think, Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen, they're just better than those corners. They just are. It's just take advantage of it and take more shots down the field. Like, yeah, Jesse Bates is an elite safety and you want to throw away from him, but you should just kind of give your receivers more of a chance. I remember seeing a deep sideline shot in the second quarter, and I was like, yeah, that's exciting. I think it was like an over-the-shoulder pass to, was it Jefferson maybe? And I think
they owned Eli Apple all game.
Yeah, precisely. And they wouldn't take advantage of that to get some kind of more valuable, deeper shots. So yeah, that was pretty annoying. But also, like, when there are 7-step drops in an offense, which is just so rare, especially without play action. Like with play action, you kind of get it because you buy some time with the action itself, with the fake. But without it, when it's just a 7-step drop, I mean, we talk about continuity from offense to offense, from Stefanski to Kubiak, but it does throw the timing off a little bit for the receivers, because they're used to these 5-step dropbacks, 3-step dropbacks with the route breaks at different points in the drop. And it felt like that might have played a role, may have been a reason that Cousins held on a little bit longer. We didn't get to see kind of the full extent of the play calling because it was such a weird game for something like play action, right? Because the Vikings just didn't. There were 2 reasons I think that the Vikings didn't engage in play action all that much. So they had a 15% play action rate. It's usually twice that. In some games, much more. One, when they did do play action, the Bengals were pretty good about like sussing it out and just attacking the quarterback, which is exactly how the 49ers and the Packers did it. But 2, you can't really credibly threaten play action on 3rd and long. Like the running game was poor. And when I was talking about how well the offensive line was doing, it was only in terms of pass protection. They were actually pretty awful as run blockers. I think all of them were. I don't think there was a good run blocking performance, if I am remembering correctly. Again, I was watching one of the defensive line and the offensive line in my review. But yeah, it's less about that because the linebackers are still biting on play action. But, when the defensive line is just choosing not to attack the running back and it working, right? They didn't need to attack the running back because Dalvin Cook was averaging like 3.8 or 3.2 yards a carry or something like that. Then they can hit the quarterback. I mean, Cousins was pressured a lot on those play action passes. So we didn't get to see what the playbook, quote unquote, should look like. But one thing that I liked from Gary Kubiak that actually Stefanski did worse, even though I think Stefanski's probably a better coordinator overall, is that there wasn't really a plan B. Like Gary did a pretty decent job of identifying kind of when something wasn't working and going to plan B or going to plan C and having an offense capable of executing. Whereas it seems like, at least from this game, when play action is taken away, when you've got 3rd and long, and there's not like an enormous amount of plays in the playbook for 3rd and 17, but when you've got a 3rd and long, and your plays just aren't there for you, like that's some of that is the playbook. Some of that is just you not calling the right plays or installing the right plays in the preseason. So yeah, there's an element of the play calling. There's an element of Cousins. There's an element of Jefferson. A lot of elements of that passing game weren't working out. And obviously the running game wasn't working either. I said CJ Ham did not have a great run blocking performance. That's true. He was probably also the least bad out of like Tyler Conklin, Chris Herndon, the offensive line. Not that Herndon had too many snaps, but like it was kind of a mess from a run blocking perspective. This was a game kind of set up for Kirk Cousins to throw the ball, and I guess he did, and it wasn't really enough.
Well, let's talk about the third wide receiver spot, because it's clear that Osborne is making his case, and this was started as a result of Jefferson getting the ball and throwing it in a play that, I mean, it probably was drawn up as a pass, but you could tell that's not what Jefferson wanted to do.
Oh yeah, it's exactly like sometimes when the Vikings would hand it off to Cordero Patterson on an end around, he would pull up to throw the ball. And I don't know if he ever actually threw the ball. I think every single time, maybe just once he didn't, but every single time he would basically be like, well, yeah, I guess my first read's closed. Well, that's too bad. And then he would just run it. And most of the time it would work out. So he felt comfortable continuing to do it. It felt like Jefferson was kind of the same mind. Like, he grabs the end around, he pulls to run, as is important to the element of the play, pulls back to throw. And I think he was surprised that somebody was open. Throws it pretty hard, actually, like maybe a little too hard, but pretty decent ball location to KJ Osborne, who was able to keep his feet in bounds. And that, starts up, you have like 79 yards, right? So more yards than Jefferson. Although I guess if you add in Jefferson's throwing yards, he ends up, credited with more. But in terms of receiver, Osborne actually outperformed Jefferson by like 7 yards. So yeah, really good performance from KJ Osborne, including like a clutch fourth down catch. He's getting open somewhat consistently when the Vikings were in 3 wide, which happened to be a fair amount. They started in 3 wide, so Osborne is technically a starter. Really good performance from him. Like if you're looking for silver linings in a loss, that's a pretty good one.
Well, we'll certainly take it. So here's the problem with the Vikings play this game. And it's related to all the things we've mentioned so far, with the possible exception of Osborne. It was 3rd and forever for what felt like the entire game.
Yeah. Sam Ekstrom had a tweet where there were, I think, six third downs where he detailed it as 3rd and 26, 3rd and 20, 3rd and 15, 3rd and 24, 3rd and 20 again, 3rd and 24 again. And then I think on top of that, where he quote tweeted that tweet again to say, or I guess he didn't, he might have replied to it. Either way, on top of that, there was also like just a surprising amount of, maybe it was Luke Braun, of like 11 yards to go, right? Which is like, you have a number of plays that are 11 yards to go, and you start out with 10 yards to go, right? You convert a new series of down, it's 10 yards to go. And the fact that the Vikings, I think, had more plays with 11 yards to go than less, really screws you up. And that's like kind of one of the things about these penalties. It's not just that you lose the yardage on the play or the yardage you would have had on the play, right? Because obviously, like the 10 yards that you lose on the penalty, that sucks, right? Especially if that play was going to be an 8-yard play, then you've lost really, 18 yards, right? It's not just that you lose the 10 yards, it's that you also significantly reduce your opportunity to convert and reduce the kind of the potential yards you would have had that penalty never occurred. Like on a false start, which is a dead play, there wouldn't have been a could have had this many yards on a false start play. On a play like that, where it's a false start on 2nd down, now it's 2nd and 20, your odds of converting 2nd and 20 into on either that down or the next down into a new series of downs are so low that if it had just been 2nd and 10, the number of yards you were going to get on average, like I don't know the actual number, but if you're 2nd and 10 at your own 15, right, because you were supposed to be at your own 25, if you're 2nd and 10 at your own 15, actually you'd be at your own 25. 2nd and 10 at your own 25, on average you probably end up with like 24 yards on the drive. Like 2nd and 10 is pretty bad, so it's not going to be a ton of yards on that drive, but let's say you get 24 yards on that drive on average, right? Well, if there's a false start and it becomes 2nd and 20 from your 15, not only do you need to get 34 yards to hit the same mark, you're less likely to get those first 10 yards in the first place because you have to find a way to convert, which allows teams to line up at the sticks, right, and close you down, and it gives them more opportunities to rush the passer. And this is kind of where it's kind of, I'm not going to say hidden yards, but it's kind of like a hidden advantage of the defense. If they know you're going to throw the ball, pressure rate doubles on 3rd and long, sack rate doubles on 3rd and long. And the reason, of course, is that they know that you have to throw the ball. So they don't read run, right? They just straight rush the passer, 1. And then 2, they put in their pass rushing personnel. So they take Dalvin Tomlinson out of there, and they put Sheldon Richardson in there, or they put Everson Griffin in there. They put better pass rushers onto the field in that situation. So your pressure rate doubles, which decreases your odds of being able to throw the ball. But also, because you have much further to go and they know exactly where you need to go, they've got, honestly, kind of less of the field to defend. So, it creates a cascade problem for you. That's not just the 10 yards you lost, but also all these potential yards because of your reduced capability of being able to convert a new set of downs to get those yards you would have gotten. So it's the 3rd downs that make it impossible to call plays, plus the 2nd downs where they get to rush the passer a lot better. Plus, the reduced odds of getting a new series of downs and those yards you're going to get later down the field, it just all piles up. It's really rough, is what I'm saying.
Well, speaking of really rough, let's talk about Breland, who did not have the best day. And I think I had tweeted at some point while he was lined up that he had the body language of a guy who was being forced to sit through IKEA on a Sunday. Like, he was not having a good day.
Yeah, and after the game, Zimmer was kind of interesting about it because they asked hey, Breland was not that great. So PFF marks him as having given up 107 yards. That does not include the yards he gives up on pass interference, right? So those are the things to keep in mind. So they asked Zimmer after the game, and he says, well, that one was really a deal where, so typically if you turn into the receiver and there's any kind of contact, they'll call that. I've seen them slack a little on that lately, but they call that almost exclusively now. Officials don't believe that you can look over your outside shoulder and look for the ball, which is incorrect, but it is what it is. So that's him sort of excusing the DPI. And then when he talked about Breland, I thought he played, there was a lot of good plays in there. He got beat on a dig, and the one honestly was a bad call. I tried to blitz them in the 2-minute drill, and he started the quarterback too long. But other than that, he did some really good things. So there he kind of takes a little bit, I guess, of the blame for that, for blitzing. And once he settled down, I thought he made some really good plays in the running game, which I guess that is true. He broke up that last 3rd down, I believe it was, to get us an opportunity to win the game, and I think it helped in overtime. It's just consistency with him. That is an overly rosy view of how Breland did, but it is an interesting aspect or a piece of nuance to add on to the overall narrative of how Breland played. I still think that that's a pretty big concern. I think when you're up against someone like a Jamar Chase or a T. Higgins, you need to be more aggressive about pressing them. First, because Jamar Chase, if you're going to identify a weakness for him, aside from pure long speed, which, he's not a 4.3 guy, right? Aside from that, it's probably his release against press. He's just not as good, which is why Cameron Dancer actually had a good game against him back in the SEC, is that he's not as good against press as he is against free releases. And the Vikings give him a lot of free releases. And I think so that's a combination of the coaching not kind of putting Breland in a position to succeed, and also Breland just kind of being a little bit late on a lot of things. Luke Braun tweeted out a video of the 50-yard touchdown that was on Breland, and to me it looked like cover 4. Luke originally identified it as cover 3. We're both kind of open to being corrected because neither of us are confident in that conclusion. But either way, it does look like Breland is attempting to sit on a dig, or more likely maybe a comeback. And so he's not willing to completely turn his hips, which, for a defensive back, that's an important decision. It's called opening the gate or the transition, where you need to fully commit to a route. And once you do that and they run a different route, you're dust, right? And so that's kind of part of the aspect of the shuffle technique that Saban teaches now, where they get to wait a little bit longer to commit to a route. It's one of the reasons the Alabama cornerbacks have done such a good job in the SEC, but sometimes they don't really succeed as much in the NFL because they're being asked to run a different technique. is because it keeps their eyes on the quarterback a little bit longer for their match zone that they run, and it prevents them from losing mobility without flipping their hips too late. Well, here, Breland is tracking a deep receiver, and he is staying vigilant against a comeback, which Jamar Chase was running, or a dig, which, I mean, Breland also got beat on that, right? And so you kind of understand where he's going, but Chase just keeps running, and it takes a while for Breland to turn his hips straight. And that's just something where you don't have a ton of film on a receiver, maybe, so you don't know how he's running routes or whether or not there's any tells for whether or not it's going to be deep pass or not. Plus, they establish tendencies that they broke later. But, really good corners have a feel for that kind of regardless. Like, obviously, film study helps them. But, like, some really good corners will just kind of have a sense of what a receiver is running as a route. And very clearly, Breland didn't have that. And so he doesn't catch up to Jamar Chase, who ends up getting a pretty deep reception there. So that is probably the biggest element of the game where you could say there was a real problem, right? Like if you said, hey, I identified this problem on special teams, I think the punting in the first half was whatever. I identified this problem on the offense. I thought the penalties were really bad, which fair enough, or Cousins wasn't doing enough in the first three quarters. Or Breland, gave up 107 yards receiving. I would think that the Breland issue stands out as perhaps the biggest problem.
Well, let's talk about something that wasn't a giant problem, and that was the pass rush, which, we had 23 sacks all last year, and we had 5 of them yesterday. And as a side note, Nick Vigil can play.
Yeah, well, especially as a pass rusher, it seems like. I would like to see a little bit more from Vigil in the run game, but we saw a lot of good stuff from Vigil in this. The one missed tackle from a defensive lineman in the run game, Nick Vigil had cleaned up and turned into a tackle for loss. So it's not as if, Vigil can't play against the run. That was a really great game from Vigil from a lot of perspectives. There was like 1 or 2 plays that got turned around in coverage, but for the most part, really great game from Nick Vigil. The pressure rate is interesting. So 34% pressure rate. I think that is pretty good considering how quickly Joe Burrow got rid of the ball. On throws, where, he's not sacked or anything like that. On throws, he gets rid of the ball in like 2.34 seconds. Incredible stuff. And the difference between Burrow getting rid of the ball quickly and Cousins kind of getting rid of the ball with that average time to throw, which is basically roughly the same, is that Burrow was getting rid of the ball out on time. Like as soon as he hits the top of his drop and then a hitch, he's throwing. And it's so hard, even when you win against your block, to be able to generate pressure and move a guy off his spot. So I thought a really good job from Burrow. But despite that, the Vikings were able to get a pretty good pressure rate. In the second half, we saw Danielle Hunter kind of double teamed a little bit more. He only ends up with 2 pressures, I think, per Pro Football Focus. I would argue that it's probably 3. Either way, his win rate against whoever he's lined up against was a little bit higher than what his pressure rate would imply. I thought he actually had a pretty decent game. Obviously, he ends up with that sack. But Michael Pierce, wow, what a game. So he comes into the game with 3.5 career sacks. He ends up with 2 more sacks, plus an additional pressure besides. And then aside from that pressure that he actually gets logged to him by PFF, he also helped create the Nick Vigil sack too. So, I think the broadcast might have called that an assist from Michael Pierce. I don't know. But really, really great performance from him. And then he also gets 2 additional tackles for loss. Incredible performance from him. I thought he was the best performing defensive lineman of that game. Really nice to see Everson Griffin in there. I think he had 17 or 18 pass rushes. He got 2 pressures on them. I thought he did really well in the role that he's kind of being suited for. Would have really liked to see more from Wanham as a pass rusher. I thought his win rate was okay, certainly better than if we were in the same spot last year, right? Like if you were to tell me last year that Wanham would perform like this, I still wouldn't have believed you. I thought it would have been too good. But that's not to say, and I was pretty down on Wanham last year, right? That's not to say that he performed well. He performed above what my expectations would have been based off of last year, but below my expectations based off of what I saw in training camp, if that kind of helps calibrate, where I've kind of fluctuated on him. I really wanted to see more from him. But that was maybe the weak spot. Tomlinson didn't get a ton of pressure. I thought he was okay in the run game. And honestly, the defensive line was actually overall really good in the run game. Wanham was pretty good in the run game. Weatherly in the run game was pretty good. Hunter, aside from that missed tackle, was doing a good job. Michael Pierce was like ruining people. But then you think, well, if the defensive line was so good in the run game, why did it feel like the Bengals were running all over us? And there's like two reasons. One, they kind of weren't. Like, we just kind of remember the two big runs plus like some key conversions. But Mixon ended up with negative expected points, which most running backs do because running is a negative expected point play. But he ended up 19th or something among running backs this weekend in expected points per play on runs. Like, it wasn't that bad. But two, there were a lot of missed tackles from cornerbacks and linebackers. I mean, Kendricks, I think, currently leads the league in tackles. And the defensive line is a big part of the reason he was able to get to the ball carrier. And also Mixon had one of the lowest yards before contact in the NFL this week too. So honestly, like, the defensive line did a pretty good job making sure that other people could make contact with the ball carrier. But you end up with like 3 missed tackles from Kendricks, which is super uncharacteristic, a missed tackle from Nick Vigil, a couple of missed tackles from safeties and cornerbacks. And that's how you get Mixon kind of running all over you, because if you've got a nose tackle that takes up 2 blocks, right, and that allows your linebacker a free shot at the running back, and then the running back jukes the linebacker, well, that's not the defensive tackle's fault. He not only did his job, he did a better job than you might expect that person to do on that play. So the defensive line, I thought, actually did a really good job in the run game. That doesn't mean the run defense for the Vikings was extraordinary. It was about average. But yeah, I thought that the defensive line is probably, aside from like the one Michael Pierce penalty, which doesn't matter because Breland committed a penalty on the same play, it was a really good performance in that defensive line. And that, I think, is kind of where the Vikings are going to need to hang their hat.
Well, we can also hang our hat on the special teams play, because the punter that they signed really saved us twice as far as booming kicks are concerned. But the special teams felt like they definitely showed up and were almost like the highlight of what the Vikings were able to do, including our kicker that I will never speak bad of for the rest of this week. Greg Joseph was the man on Sunday.
Yeah, great job on the game tying kick. Crazy, pressure situation. Love to see it. I know Vikings fans were like basically dreading that he'd miss it, and I think fairly so, given his history and the Vikings' history. So fantastic from him. Great second half from Jordan Berry. I do want to say that the first half, he wasn't all that great of a punter. The biggest problem is that he had 8 punts, which is not his fault. But like, he punted so many times that he could make up for a shaky initial performance, right? Like, oh boy, okay. But he 8 punts over 400 punting yards. It's not great when you've got more punting yards than passing yards. Right?
I really have to find a way to incorporate punting yards into one of the Norse code leagues next year, because that's absurd.
Oh yeah, I think running another experimental league with punting yards and a punter would be. That sounds dope. That sounds so Norse code, right? It's so perfectly Norse code.
Truly.
But yeah, his average punt was only, net 43.6. He had a really high rate of returned punts and a pretty low average hang time, despite that being the very reason the Vikings signed him. But that's an aggregate. The second half, he performed a lot better. He nailed that punt really late in the game, 63 yards inside the 20, goes out of bounds or it gets downed. Just a fantastic punt in the corner. One thing that was kind of interesting is I don't even know if this part is on Jordan Berry. The Gunners in the first half were getting so beat up, like especially Harrison Hand. One thing that I learned while kind of talking to people who pay a little bit more attention to special teams than I do, is that one of the reasons the Vikings like Harrison Hand is that he's a really good gunner against single jammers. And usually teams will line up 2 jammers on each gunner and prevent them from being able to, go down the field and tackle the punt returner. But there are a lot of times, including at least once in this game, where they'll only have 1 jammer lined up against the gunner because they're bringing those 2 in from either side to help block the punt. And that occurred when the Vikings were backed up, I think, at their own 2-yard line, and Jordan Berry was kicking out of the Vikings end zone, which that's tough because the punters have to quicken their process. And if you quicken your process, it changes the entire mechanics of the punt. and it can really screw you up. Like that's how you get some of these like 18-yard punts or whatever. So credit to Barry, that was at least a normal punt in that situation where you have to quicken your process. But yeah, in that situation, Harrison Hand does a really great job against single coverage, but he's not great at splitting double coverage, which is kind of why, you want to have someone like a Dan Chisna, I guess Chisena is how they're pronouncing it now, who's now on IR. That kind of, and Hand is essentially their third gunner. Now he's their second because of Chisna hitting the injured reserve. But seeing him get beat up in the first half against those two jammers, I was starting to like really get it. Like he was pushed so far out of bounds that he actually ended up making a play because he goes back up and around and he comes out of nowhere, at least according to the broadcast, goes back up out of nowhere and ends up tackling the guy. But yeah, I think for the most part, the coverage was good aside from that. Like, Cameron Bynum had essentially a punt saving or a touchdown saving tackle. We saw some good stuff from Chris Boyd as a gunner. Yeah, the special teams unit, especially the kickoff coverage unit, was doing a really good job. And overall, the special teams, especially in the second half, really stepped up and kind of helped the Vikings with that fairly awful special teams performance that they had last year.
Well, let's talk about the ending. And my biggest problem with what Kirk Cousins did this game involved his inability to clock the ball during the 2-minute drills. And it seemed like he, especially near the end, he was really in hurry up mode and just refusing to clock the ball until the very, very, very end. And it seemed like, and I'm just talking about the end of the fourth quarter at this point, not overtime. It seemed to me like it was an incredibly arrogant decision to be like, no, we're just going to let this clock tick. We don't have any time. We have no timeouts here. We'll make this work. Like we're just going to dink and dunk. We're not going to toss to the sideline. And if you're not going to toss to the sideline, you are putting yourself in a situation where you have to clock it. And I know Kirk Cousins, the end of the fourth quarter suggests that either he knows more than me or he got incredibly lucky.
So this is actually one situation. I think I'm going to disagree with you here where, not that he was like perfect in that management. Yeah, I think there was a moment where he was calling for a spike and they didn't have enough downs left for it. So like he clearly wasn't like perfectly in tune with everything. But I tend to prefer teams running a play really quickly instead of spiking it. And the team actually ended up lining up and hiking the ball quickly. Like I've never seen the Vikings do this in the Zimmer era, honestly. I don't know if it's because of Clint Kubiak. I don't know if it's because of Kirk Cousins. I don't know if it's because of Mike Zimmer. But when they hit the 17-yarder, the somewhat deep throw over the middle, I think it was to KJ Osborne. Maybe it was even on fourth down.
It was to KJ Osborne.
Yeah. And they run up to midfield or something. I think they were just behind the 50. I think everyone kind of expects him to spike the ball and use it down there, right? Because they don't have any timeouts, so they would have to go from first down to second down. And I tend to prefer kind of slightly, if you're able to run up to the line of scrimmage quickly and get lined up without committing a penalty, like that's where a lot of illegal formation penalties might be. And that's, I think, the bigger danger than the clock.
And there's the 10-second runoff, too.
Exactly. But if you run up, everyone is lined up correctly, and you run a play, whether it's a speed out or a slant or something along those lines, where you either throw the ball at your intended receiver or you throw it 5 feet over his head to stop the clock. Either way, that I think is more positive expected value than spiking it to lose it down but gain a timeout, essentially. I think that's probably the correct decision, and I was at least excited that the Vikings wanted to do that. I was pretty impressed that they were. I don't even know if it's the right decision. I think it might be, but I was impressed that they were at least willing to try it, even though they didn't get any yards in the play because they did end up throwing it over Jefferson's head, I think.
Well, just the fact they've never successfully done this. This is not a staple of Vikings offense.
Yeah. And honestly, things that are not a staple of the Vikings 2-minute drill, we should probably just begin embracing on principle, right?
Wait. Am I sitting here in a situation of saying that I want, Cousins to actually be more daring and be a leader and, really and take a couple of chances out there? Oh, and I'm telling him right now he needs to slow down and play it safe. Oh. Oh, no, I'm a gigantic hypocrite.
Yeah, but I mean, I again, I don't know if I strongly believe this, but I like that they tried it. So I'll say that. That said, I do think that there is an accurate criticism to be made that he still loves the middle of the field in 2-minute drills, and that's bothersome. He doesn't take that many chances on the sideline. They don't tend to call that many plays that put a bunch of receivers on the sideline. And you've got 2 elite sideline players, well, maybe 1 elite sideline player and 1 good one. So Adam Thielen's your elite sideline guy, crazy body control on the sidelines, and Jefferson's pretty good at it. So with that, I think you just kind of want to create more opportunities for your receivers to be there. And hey, it looks like Osborne's not bad on sideline balls either, right? So I'm not saying don't have any receivers run over the middle of the field. Obviously, you need to do that. Otherwise, the defense is just going to put 6 coverage players on the sidelines, 1 over the middle, and then the rest kind of rush you. But I think that because Cousins is fairly textbook in his approach to defenses, he throws to the most open receiver he can find, which in most situations is great, but in a 2-minute drill is exactly what the defense wants you to do, and you're wasting time off the clock. That, I think, is an accurate criticism. I would have liked to see more sideline stuff. That's something where I'm open to kind of being corrected if the All-22 ever comes out. Good. Separate conversation. But
so much hate.
I cannot believe what they did. But yeah, for the moment, it's going to be my default take on Cousins and the way that he approaches 2-minute drills, which is that he takes the yards over the time a little bit too aggressively. Not that quarterbacks do it the other way around a little bit too aggressively or doing a good job either. That's probably worse. I'd rather take the yards, but it's not a good balance where he's at. And he seemed to have improved on that clock versus yards balance in this game just a little bit. But the yards over the middle that take time off the clock, that's tough. So, yeah, I mean, I thought he managed it okay, in part because of how quickly they were able to get to the line of scrimmage, which, God, I don't remember ever seeing Cousins doing that in a Vikings uniform.
Yeah, it was a little odd. I will admit it was a little odd. They were successfully able to do it, but let's talk about the end of the game, and let's talk about that final drive for Minnesota before we talk about Joe Burrow outsmarting the Vikings defense. So you have the run by Cook. I even said aloud while watching the game, okay, run it 1 or 2 more times here, and you're good. You can kick it. You can make this happen. And then there is a quote-unquote fumble that is not overturned.
So my take on this is actually, it's not that the refs got it right or wrong. I actually do not know. And I watched the replay because live, from the press box, there's no way I would have been able to tell. So the only way I can tell is from the replay. I think that watching the replay, the refs just don't have the evidence to overturn it. And I think I didn't listen to what Mike Pereira said on the broadcast, and that always influences people in terms of their opinion of the calls. And I just didn't, I either didn't have the sound on or I didn't watch that part with the broadcast. But I thought, based off of what we saw, that actually that was fairly close. And a bunch of people have tweeted out like a screenshot of the ball in Cook's hand as his butt's on the ground. And I get like the catharsis of that, but that's like not how this is decided. Because if the ball is moving while he's hitting the ground, then it's considered out. And so a still shot is never going to get that to you. And I thought, based off of what I saw from one of the replays, that you could argue that the ball did begin to move before he hit the ground. And it was close enough that the call on the field stood. If I were the Bengals and that was not a fumble, if the refs ruled him down and I were the Bengals and I challenged it, I also think the refs should stick with the call on the field, right? I just don't think that based off of what we saw, that there was enough evidence to say that it was a fumble or not. And I just think a still frame to make the argument is a bad argument, because the determination is based off of motion. So a still frame can't help, right? Like, it's not the same as like a touchdown, right? Where if the ball is across the line and the ball carrier doesn't have any part of his body except for his feet on the ground, a still frame is really useful. That's helpful. But for a fumble call, if the ball is beginning to get out of your hands, if there's movement of the ball, then whether or not it looks like it's in his possession in a still frame when he's down, that's not all that relevant. So I want to add that. Which, yeah, I did get actually a question about this, whether or not Dalvin Cook seems to fumble a little bit more often than other running backs around the league. And so I looked it up, and one issue with looking at fumble percentage is that unless you do kind of a deeper dive and spend a little bit more time sanitizing your data, you're probably also going to include fumbles from kickoff returns, which is just much more likely, punt returns, which is way more likely, which is why Amir Abdullah's fumble rate is so high, is because, you know, he's also a returner. And so his fumble rate is higher than it actually is, although that is still a concern. And then also sometimes you get the fumbles that occur on receptions getting counted as fumbles on rushes, because you take a look at, like, say, Pro Football Reference, and you count up all the fumbles. That includes fumbles from both rushing and receiving. And then if you divide by rushing attempts, you're also including fumbles that occurred on receptions. Like, remember Adrian Peterson's fumble against the Seahawks in 2015 in the playoffs was on a reception, right? So that's something to keep in mind. That said, Dalvin Cook's fumble per rush attempt rate is the third highest since 2015. And remember, he entered the league in 2017, but I wanted to include a bunch of contemporary running backs. So any running back with at least 500 attempts since 2015, including the 2015 season, that's 49 running backs. Dalvin Cook ranks third. Where do you think Adrian Peterson ranks?
Adrian Peterson has to rank either 1 or 2.
Wrong. He ranks 6th. Now, remember, this is since 2015, right? So his fumbles from the 2007 to 2014 era, which were prolific, aren't counted here. So if you looked at Adrian Peterson's career fumble rate, it is in fact higher than Dalvin Cook's. But Adrian Peterson's fumbles since 2015, which still includes over 1,000 attempts, by the way, is lower than Dalvin Cook's fumble rate since 2015, or I guess Dalvin Cook's career fumble rate. So that's something to keep in mind, is that Cook, there's like a couple of like perceptions about Cook that are worth evaluating, and one of them is his ball security, and that includes his ability to catch passes. He's not that great of a receiver. Everyone just kind of assumes he is, and it's kind of annoying. We talked about that, I think, at the beginning of the season or the beginning of training camp or something like that. We talked about it pretty recently. But also that he tends to fumble the ball a lot. You know, just ahead of him are Chris Ivory and David Johnson. That's it. After that, it's Chris Carson, Dion Lewis, Adrian Peterson, Zeke, Kenyon Drake, then Melvin Gordon, Jay Ajayi, and then after that, it's pretty irrelevant. Like, you've got a couple at 1.39%, Dalvin Cook's fumble rate of 1.65%, and these are small margins, right? So, you know, if he has one more fumble, that like spikes up dramatically. If he has one fewer fumble, it drops somewhat dramatically. If he has one fewer fumble, for example, he drops to like 1.52%, which, you know, is a pretty big jump from between 1.4 and 1.6. But that's where he is, 1.65%. He has recovered 2 of his own fumbles. I remember at least one of them occurring near an opening game, one of the first 2 games of the season. But yeah, that's an issue, right? If you've got more than 1.5% chance of fumbling on a particular play, it gets kind of tough, especially if you're trying to give this guy the ball a bunch of times. Now, obviously, the Vikings, drop back to pass a bunch, so Cook didn't actually carry the ball that much in this game. But it's still something to kind of just keep in mind. Like, if you think Alexander Mattison is better ball security, and you might not, right? If you're the Vikings, you might think that Dalvin Cook is better ball security. But in that situation, you might be better to put in your worst running back because they hold on to the ball better. Like, Cook at this point is a small but relevant, as we saw, liability in terms of holding on to the ball. Now, if it's like the second quarter and it's 1st and 10 and you want to run the ball, yeah, I'd rather give it to Dalvin Cook than Alexander Madison, obviously. But if it's like overtime and the next score wins, I want somebody who's going to hold on to the ball. And so you might want to put in Alexander Madison in that situation. So that's also something to keep in mind. Now, I know some people still think he didn't fumble the ball, but it is probably a concern that he got close enough, right? Like that's like the next thing to bring up is that like whether or not, like there are a couple of times where Dalvin Cook has lost the ball and it hasn't counted as a fumble because it turned out he was down. I would like to not worry about that, period, right? So that is a situation where maybe the Vikings should evaluate whether or not they want to give it to Dalvin Cook. I think based off of kind of how the Vikings' philosophy surrounding this, they won't. And if I brought it up at a presser, and I don't know, I might, they would probably look at me like I'm crazy, right? Like, what? Who would not take the ball out of Dalvin Cook's hands? Are you kidding me? But that's something worth thinking about. So yeah, I that's like a concern going forward. I think Dalvin Cook is one of the best running backs in the NFL. I think we don't talk about his ball security or his pass catching enough.
Well, let's talk about Joe Burrow outsmarting the Vikings defense here to end the game. A kick happened afterwards, fine, but this was Joe Burrow changing a play and just making the Vikings defenders look dumb.
Yeah. So the Vikings saw that Cincinnati, in a similar situation in the past, had lined up to quarterback sneak or hand off the ball and have in fact run a play action with a tight end crossing the field on the opposite side of where he lined up. So that week in practice, they practiced that particular play a couple of times. So from a coaching perspective, probably they were prepared. And I say probably because maybe they weren't teaching the right techniques or, whatever, right? Like there's room for error there. But for the most part, based off of what we heard from a coaching perspective, they were alert and aware of the play action. I watched that play again, posted that video to Twitter, and I agree. I think it looks like that they were pretty aware that play action was a possibility. And, Patrick Peterson is running across the formation to cover Tyler Boyd, who's in motion. A couple of other players, take a step forward because that's what play action does to you, right? It forces you to defend the run, and then they drop back really quickly. So it's not as if the Vikings defense was completely fooled into not knowing that this was possibility of a play action. Xavier Woods loses CJ Uzomah on the crossfield route. And the thing is, he knows to pick him up, right? I don't know if that's technically his assignment. I think it is based off of the coverage rules, but I don't know that for a fact. Could have been Harrison Smith's assignment. Someone else pointed out that it could have been. But if that's the case, then Harrison Smith runs into Nick Vigil. I don't know how much I would blame him for that. But Woods kind of picks him up, and for like the first half a second of that play, it looks fine. Looks like he's figured it out. And then it just kind of loses him. So I don't know if it's because he looked back at the quarterback or whatever, but that one's pretty rough. And later it comes out, and by later, I mean like an hour later, Joe Burrow or the coach, I think it's the coach actually, Zach Taylor reveals that was initially called a quarterback sneak, but Burrow changes the play, the line of scrimmage based off of the front he sees. Fantastic, killer job. Banner day for young Bengals players, right? Joe Burrow, second-year player, Jamar Chase, first-year player, Evan McPherson, first-year player. Incredible job. But T. Higgins, third-year player, or second-year player. Yeah. That was, I don't know, Burrow had a great game. I don't want to take that away from him. Really great game. Really great at getting the ball out of time, reading the defense quickly, dealing with the muddy pocket and stuff like that. But that was obviously the highlight of that game.
Well, let's go to the mailbag, and there's a number of questions in here. Let's try to go through some of these a little bit brief. Bob Marks starts us off with, regarding Breland, how common is it for NFL defensive backs to get injured coincidentally on every play they get burned on?
I think it is notable, but I'm always reticent to say that they're doing it to cover up an injury. Like, there are a couple of times where Xavier Rhodes pulls up for an injury after a play that he got burned on, and people are like, he's faking an injury. And it turns out he wasn't. But there's enough times where it doesn't feel like that's true, or that he doesn't show up on an injury report later, or that he only misses one play and chases someone down without any sign of an injury, that I can understand why people are a little bit askance. I don't know. watching the play again, this was the 50-yard touchdown, right? Watching the play again, it did not look like Breland sustained a kind of injury that occurred mid-play where he had to pull up or that there was a hitch in his step as a result of it. He did see the field again, but you can never know. Like, it might have actually happened. It does seem to happen suspiciously high for defensive backs who get burned, but if I want the most charitable possible interpretation, that is also a reason that one could get burned, is that your hamstring gets you or something like that. I know that the last time that Xavier Rhodes pulled up for an injury after getting burned, which was with the Colts in a Colts uniform, it turns out he actually was injured. So, and he was like on the injury report, he like missed a game. Like, you know, these things do actually happen. I am not going to say that Breland did that.
Like, it wasn't just a case of like literal bruise to ego.
I'm not saying it's not that either.
Well, Christopher Corey asks, did Kirk look like a veteran QB in control of the team or a scared rookie hoping not to mess up?
I think that in the 2-minute drill, Kirk looked like a veteran quarterback in control of the team. I think that early in the game, he looked more similar to a scared rookie hoping not to screw up.
Fair enough. Let's go to Professor Poop, who had to enjoy this game. Said, obviously, I enjoyed numerous facets of this game as it had everything this fecal microbiologist needed out of his favorite NFL team. Couple of questions. Number one, on the Professor Poop's world-famous poopiness inquiry and surveillance scale from 0 to 10, how much of a fecal disaster was the O-line?
The PISS scale?
Yes.
I would say it's a 7. I wouldn't say it's anywhere near a 10. I mean, like the O-line ended up getting called for like 9 penalties, right? Because a lot of the false starts weren't actually on the offensive line, but they still had a pair of illegal formation penalties and stuff like that. So, and I totally forgot this. Oli Udoh was also called for like unnecessary roughness, which I guess that's the one penalty you can like give an offensive lineman and not be too upset about. It's the other 9 that like bother you. But I would say it's a 7. The pass protection was fine. The run blocking was abysmal. The penalties were a huge problem. But I remember the 2016 offensive line. Like, the fact that Sam Bradford survived that season, pretty incredible. Like, in terms of worst offensive lines, it's probably 2016, then 2015, which did give up a substantially higher pressure rate, but Teddy was holding onto the ball a lot more. Then probably, like, it probably goes in like 2016, 2015, 2014, 2017, because Case Keenum saved them a lot. Maybe 2017 was worse than 2014. Either way, all those seasons look worse. Although, I mean, like, this game was worse than a number of games that even that 2016 line had. But I've seen some pretty bad games. Like, I've seen Willie Beavers and TJ Clemmings start. Like, this was not that.
Also, number 2, Cousins appeared to have a fairly non-poopy performance. As someone who is a bit of a pessimist and overreactionary, a requirement for my particular field, if this season truly is a fecal disaster, should we, quote, blow it up, or try to hire an offensive coach to cater to Cousins? To clarify this, should we try to blow it up entirely, fire everyone, trade Cousins, draft/sign a QB to compete with Mond, or hire an offensive-minded head coach, give Cousins a short extension, and a transition to a heavy passing offense? Personally, I like Zim. This is all hypothetical.
It kind of depends on when you do this. But like, if the season's truly a disaster, should they blow it up? I like Zim too, but like, I feel like, and normally I'd want to keep Zim, but if he can't find, especially if the season is relatively healthy, if he can't find a way to scrape together enough wins to at least be competitive for a divisional race, especially now that we're functionally starting out 0-0, might as well fire Zim, fire Spielman, promote Jamal Stevenson, see if he's got something new up his sleeve, or hire another GM. I don't know, and look around the coaching sphere. And honestly, like, I know that like the history of college coaches going into the NFL is pretty poor. Famously Nick Saban, currently Urban Meyer, or remember Chip Kelly. I wouldn't be like opposed to a Lincoln Riley, right? And I don't know that Cliff Kingsbury is doing all that great in Arizona. Great game against Tennessee, but I don't know that like his tenure tells us that was a great decision yet. But I wouldn't mind Lincoln Riley. I'd be pretty wary because of that history, but I wouldn't mind it. Otherwise, I'd love to kind of see what they could kind of do with an offensive-minded coach. and maybe a potentially different draft philosophy. So that would make sense. Signing a quarterback or drafting a quarterback to compete with Mond, yeah, absolutely. Especially if you've got a new coach and a new GM, you're not tied to Mond. You don't have to. If Mond wins the job, fine, right? But you're not tied to him. So not that he's a third round pick. Not that you would be if you kept the same regime. But having more like the worst thing that can happen, right, is that they're both bad. But if they're both bad, at least you tried to get one. The best thing that could happen is, oh no, they're both good. Like crap, right? Maybe you could trade Mond for something in that case, or keep both, right? Like no one's going to realize Mond's true value if he's good and he's only playing in the preseason, and then you can sign him to a good deal as a backup quarterback, or he ends up signing a pretty big deal later on, and you get like a 4th round compensatory pick along with your offensive coordinator leaving and using Mond as his starter. I don't know. But I think it makes sense to blow it up if this season can't be salvaged, especially now that the division is 0-0.
I wonder if you could get Kurt Signetti from James Madison University out there as a potential hire. I mean, it would weaken the Dukes, but you could bring his winning ways out to Minnesota.
I mean, you've got to have somebody who's been there, right? Mm. And he's had a ton of success in the playoffs. He's got FBS success, so we know that he can coach at a higher level, which this would barely be, right? Between winning the FCS playoffs like he's done and playing in the NFL, barely a change. But his record since joining James Madison was 2019. Really incredible stuff. And he's played quarterback. He's a quarterback, I think, for West Virginia. He would know how to relate to the quarterback that he drafts. Maybe bring in Ben DiNucci, somebody who can compete with Kellen Mond. Bring in another quarterback. I think DiNucci would probably win that competition, but you got to make it fair. You got to have a real competition.
Well,
Cincinnati coached Philip Rivers, right? So
there's options. I'm just throwing it out because it's a name that you might have missed. Let's go to Don Kedick, who asks, for Arif's curses and hexes corner, after slaying the dragon by making a clutch 53-yard field goal to tie the game as time expired, did we remove the kicking curse to unfortunately become hexed by the fumble gods? Please explain.
No, I think you're in both. You're in both. The kicking curse is still active, especially now that people actually trust Joseph. That's when the curse gets activated, right? It's not when you expect the kicker to miss and he misses. That did happen with Dan Bailey. But it's the curse is really at its most powerful when you begin to trust the kicker. Now that he's performed in a clutch situation, the curse is active. And that wasn't a game-winning kick. It was a game-tying kick, right? If the Vikings had set up for a game-winning kick and then he kicked the game winner, then maybe, right? Remember, Blair Walsh kicked a couple of game winners too, right? So it's not as if like that's it. But he didn't even kick the game winner. So I don't think you're out of the woods there yet. And I mean, the secret is that you've always been hexed by the fumble gods. The years where Dalvin Cook doesn't fumble, Kirk Cousins does.
It's just the way it works. Ojibwe Pun asks, what's the most obscenely positive spin Arif can put on that last Vikings football event?
Obscene? It would be obscene. You just talk if you take a look at the game, so many of the problems are correctables, right? Especially, this was the 4th preseason game. You've got 16 games ahead of you. Everyone in the division is tied 0-0. If anything, you've got to lead on the division because you've got the first tiebreaker, which is conference, or not the first tiebreaker, but the first active tiebreaker, which is conference record, plus the second tiebreaker, point differential. The Vikings have the highest EPA in the division, both offensively and defensively. You take a look at the way that the offensive linemen performed in the most important aspect of football, which is pass protection. They actually did a really good job there. And the stuff that they were bad at, that's not endemic. Zimmer has a history of correcting players with penalty issues and removing those penalties as the season goes forward. And And knowing that you finally got a full game experience plus overtime in the preseason. I mean, what were we talking about in the last preseason? They only had like 3-4 drives, right? And so you were concerned that the offense didn't score a touchdown in the preseason. Well, in this fourth preseason game we just had, they scored a number of touchdowns. Really great stuff. Adam Thielen proved that touchdown regression just doesn't exist for him. He had 2 touchdowns in this game. Obviously there's some kinks to work out with the offense, but I think that they showed that even in a game where they're forced to throw the ball all the time, that they can get one out. Plus, people are concerned about Crook's ability to win in the 2-minute. Absolutely did a great job in the 2-minute drill, driving the Vikings down the field, setting up a game-tying kick. Just a really incredible performance. It's really what you need to look for here, or what are the projectables. Penalty performance is less sustainable over the course of a season than your technical performance in things like pass protection, your ability to win as a receiver. Like, the only real problem offensively is that they didn't get enough room to run. But when has Dalvin Cook not had that? He had a worse offensive line at Florida State from a run blocking perspective than he did with the Vikings, and he's still been able to produce with the Vikings. So, God, what obscene. It's great. This is great news.
All right, let's go to Ryan, who asks, Mike Zimmer seems to rarely accept responsibility for poor performances and regularly pushes back blame to players and throws them under the bus. It seemed like he was pushed back at it again on Sunday. His criticism of Cousins at halftime was discussed by broadcast, who seemed to disagree with it, and Mike Sando also briefly discussed it in an athletic piece. So, 2 questions. Number 1, is Mike Zimmer significantly slower to take responsibility and quicker to blame players relative to other NFL coaches? And 2, does this really impact the players/team, or do they not pay nearly as much attention to it as the fans and the media do?
Zimmer's interesting in this case because when he talks about it from a season-long perspective, he puts a lot of blame on himself in terms of putting players in the right position. When you talk to him about, last year and the way the defense performed, he talks about how slow he was to adapt, how he put the defense in a bad position, how he's not calling the right plays, and about how it's on him to put players in the right position to succeed, and he didn't do that. Individual games, he will pay more attention to what the players could have done better. Although he will bring up stuff that he did. Like I read that quote from about Bashad Breeland, where he does take some of the blame on himself. He does say that Breeland was looking back, or he looked back at the quarterback a little bit too often. But he does say that, maybe I called the wrong play in the 2-minute. Like, he will do that. But when it is like an individual game, he's much more likely to talk about the players or at halftime. And one can read that as intentional, right? Because you can say, well, we nail your feet to the ground after games because that's when we're most emotional, most visceral about a game. And so if you blame a player after a loss, that's going to stick a lot more than if you blame yourself after the season is over for the season. It just has a lot less emotional resonance. And so you get to take credit for being humble without actually having to take the slings and arrows, right? So you can read that as intentional. I don't know if that's the case. I think there's a little bit of it there. He will talk about mistakes he makes, but at the same time, that's just kind of how he sees it. Like, he doesn't play a lot of, like, he's done a better job of it since then. But he doesn't play a lot of politics with the media about who to blame, who not to blame. I think other coaches, even on the Viking staff, do a more explicit job of playing with the playing with politics and the media to try and kind of shift, who gets credit, who gets blame, especially across the league. But I think that there's an element to that here. I don't think it is that intentional or it's that big, and there's at least that element where over a large period of time, it doesn't even have to be after a season. Like, he'll talk about the first 4, like after the first 4 games, he would talk about the mistakes that he made. So that's fine. But there is that. So second, does this really impact the players of the team? I think it does, for sure. I don't think it affects them as much as we tend to say, or as much as big as we make it to be, right? So we find a story, we blow it up, that becomes a big story. I think that the impact in the locker room is extant. I think it's there, right? But I don't think it's as big, right, as the story seems to be as it begins to take a life of its own. Hopefully that answered the question.
All right, let's go to our next question, which is from Kyle Slaby, who asks, which former Viking would have helped us most this weekend? Reef, Hughes, Bridgewater, Harris, or dealer's choice?
I actually didn't see how Anthony Harris performed with the Eagles. I'd like to see that. In the meantime, I'll just take the PFF grade as gospel, even though I say that we don't do that. So let's take a look at how Anthony Harris did with the Eagles. I think for a while it looked like he was going to start alongside what's his name, Marcus Epps, but I think Rodney McLeod did understand. Okay, so he does not appear in the first 50 results. Is he? Did he play? Was he graded? Oh boy, he got a 52.5 grade. Jeez. Well, probably not him then, huh?
I think he's out.
Let's see. Riley Reef might have helped. I think he would have gotten fewer penalties, and we talked about how that's bigger than just the yards you lose. Mike Hughes did get that game-sealing pick. I don't know if that would have been enough, although any turnover here would have been enough. Bridgewater was the highest graded at the conclusion of the afternoon games. A couple of other players ended up getting somewhat higher grades at the quarterback position, but he had a great game, fantastic game from Bridgewater. I don't know that the issue here was really a quarterback performance at the end of the day. So I'm going to go with Riley Reef. Like, even though typically because the quarterback is the most important position and small differences at quarterback mean more than large differences at other positions, especially, an individual of a 5-person unit like the offensive line, I would say that the difference was somewhat small enough, even though Bridgewater's thing is like end of game management. I'd say the difference was small enough. Oh, and Bridgewater was able to perform even though Jerry Jeudy got hurt and couldn't participate for most of the game. I would say that losing the 2 penalties that you get from Rashad Hill in there and you have with Riley Reef in there, not that he never commits a penalty, but let's just imagine he doesn't in this game, plus the somewhat better pass protection you get from him, and better run blocking than Rashad Hill, that probably helps more. But I'm willing to be argued on that. As whether I'd have Mike Hughes or Bashad Breeland, I mean, I don't know, man. Mike Hughes with the Vikings got burned a fair amount, so this might be a situation where the Vikings can't win, because if they keep Mike Hughes, he remains bad. If they move him, they look bad for having moved him.
Yeah. Kyle Slaby also asks, is Aaron Rodgers intentionally tanking the Packers before he heads out in the offseason?
That'd be funny. I don't think so. I think Rodgers' form of having a chip on his shoulder is winning. And I think he wants to maximize his appeal to another organization. So winning is the best way to do that. But it is funny.
Man, that the long bomb that turned into an interception for him.
Mm-hmm.
What an amazing misread. Not only did he overthrow his receiver by a week and a half, but the fact that the corner was out there. Was that a corner or a safety?
Was it a safety?
That was, as I say, was that a corner or a safety that ended up picking that off? It was pure trick. This is something that Aaron Rodgers knows in his sleep, that coverage. It's foolish to think that he threw it that poorly. But man, he put that in a place that only that defender could get to.
Yeah, right. It's exclusive real estate for the defender.
Yeah, it was just ridiculous. Let's go to Tampa Bay Vipers for life. Does it feel better to not have to blame a kicker, have to blame a kicker for another heartbreaking loss, or is fumbling the game away worse?
It's worse. Also, the Vikings have had both happen in the same game of a playoff game. So really, honestly, either one is just a shadow of the big ones, right? Adrian Peterson fumbling against the Seahawks in 2015, and then also Blair Walsh missing the 27-yarder. Either of those don't happen, the Vikings win, right? This is just a shadow of that. This is just all right, well, Dalvin Cook fumbled in overtime and the Vikings lost as a result, kind of. That sucks. Vikings.
Arif's neglected resistance bands asks, will Arif hang out more since all 22 is not working? You Endure asks, for the show's body horror count, roughly how much gore in your media is too much for you? I used to be quite squeamish, but acclimated over time to the point where The Thing is one of my favorite movies. This question was inspired by the Packers game.
It honestly, it depends. Literal blood does not tend to bother me that much, although it depends on my mood. Stuff like seeing a player injury, if you can kind of see like the break, and then you can kind of see, I don't want to describe in too much detail, but you can see in motion from the broadcast the break occurring. That kind of squicks me out half the time. The other half the time it doesn't. The biggest issue with body horror do you remember the old clickbait ads where they would Photoshop like flower seed pods onto a thumb or something like that? And they're like, hey, watch out for this disease.
Yep.
That's way worse than like seeing someone's head get torn off in a movie, honestly. And like, even though the movie has sound, it has motion, you're attached to the character a lot of the time, and so it means more. Dude, that thumb, I'm out. So like, it really kind of depends on my mood or my emotional state at the time, and also the nature of it, because I can handle a lot of blood fairly easily most of the time. But like a broken bone, sometimes I can't. Weird body stuff that's not related to any of that, like the one I just described, sometimes I can't. Many of the times I can't. So it really kind of depends. I would say the Packers game, were I to be a person that cheered for the Packers or something like that, that would be something that, because I don't have the emotional endurance, because I haven't seen that many meltdowns as a Packers fan over the course of my life, that would hurt more, right? It's like I haven't built up an immunity, right? Because I rarely get sick now, because I used to spend a bunch of time in Bangladesh, and I would get stomach bugs, and I get all kinds of diseases in Bangladesh, and I'd be so I don't get sick that much, right? Especially to like food poisoning and stuff like that. Like I would eat the same food as a lot of my friends. They would get food poisoning. I wouldn't. It's kind of the same thing. I have experienced the first world of Aaron Rodgers being able to lead my team to victory most of the time. Well, once at least. And not that many game-breaking picks. And then I see that game, they score 3 points. Man, I'd be feeling some kind of way. I think Vikings fans are kind of like, this game sucked. I think a lot of them are kind of over it. Not like over it because they're still mad at the team, but like the emotional shock of the game. Whatever. Most of the jokes about the game are being made by Vikings fans.
Well, let's go to our next question, which is kind of also on the same topic. Bethany asks, did you initially start watching the Packers-Saints game from the beginning, or did you switch once they put in Love so that you could laugh at Green Bay's pain?
I started watching at the beginning, partly because I had to do a recap of that week's games for The Lead, which is an athletic podcast. So I needed to watch a bunch of these games while I'm like writing up my game report. It sucks. I don't recommend it. But I did get to watch the game. It was very amusing, especially because like I get to run with my take that Jameis Winston's good because he can see now. Like that's a fun one.
That's the new can't throw left.
Right. Yeah.
What's funny to me is I wasn't planning on watching most of it. I was summoned over to my parents' house to fix her computer. And I was just kind of settled into like the fact that, okay, I'm going to do this for a little bit. It's really annoying, whatever. And then my dad of all people yells, James, you're going to want to come in and take a look at this. And it was that long pick. And it was just like, we slowed it down on Hulu and everything, just like, and I'm trying to figure out what Aaron Rodgers was thinking with the safety there. And just, it was so much fun to just sit and like, it was a nice that was a heartwarming moment. That was wholesome content right there. So I ended up seeing a bit of the game there, and then I came home and I had to watch the rest. Like yeah, Jordan Love was in. How do you not watch that? No, it's the Brooklyn Nine-Nine thing. Who wouldn't want to see a man fight a crocodile? Like this is you kind of have to see this. Evan T. Creed asks, for the butterfly effect corner, O-line coaching and QB wide receiver reps were both issues that were exacerbated this offseason due to a vaccine hesitancy. If Mark Zuckerberg didn't make a creepy website in college, do the Vikings win this game?
So here's my take on this. I think what is it that Jeff Goldblum said? Nature finds a way.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that social media would have emerged regardless, right? Like I think if we didn't have Facebook, we would either have turned MySpace into Facebook, or if Facebook would have emerged regardless, or something along those lines. Any form of somewhat democratic media being infiltrated by a misinformation. It's my official stance is that most of the anti-vaccination stuff is misinformation. If you don't like the podcast, I don't understand how you haven't reached that point at this point. But yeah, I think that would have happened anyway. Like, now that it has happened, yeah, Zuckerberg's responsible. I'm not saying that like he and Facebook are not responsible for a lot of the stuff that occurs in their platform. What I'm saying is if it wasn't him, someone else probably would have done it, just because like that was just a niche waiting to be filled. I mean, like Facebook wasn't even originally what it is now, right? It was like, well, it was a creepy website to rank how hot, people on campus were. But by the time that I had joined, you'd still needed to have a .edu email to join, and it was just status updates. Like linking was not embedded in they didn't have a preview of the link.
No, it was status updates and pictures. Yeah,
it was pictures and like telling people it's the joke that people have about what Twitter used to be. Facebook actually was, right? And oh my God, remember the statuses used to say your name is as the default, and then you just have to fill in the rest.
Yep.
Like it prompted you to provide a like state of being, because they had a helping verb in there, so it was always passive voice. So Arif is eating breakfast would be like what your status would be. Wild. Now they're posts. They're not even statuses. They're just posts, because your status would be stuck at the top of your profile page, and it's your status, which like is a huge difference. So yeah, Facebook wasn't even what it was. It emerged to become this, and had Facebook not done it, either another existing social media site would have done it, or a different one would have been made, especially because Zuckerberg stole it, right? Like the Winklevoss twins would have made it, and then we would have the same problems.
All right, next question we have is from Kevin, who asks, for Arif's child rearing and bee corners.
Good mix. Great to mix those.
Well, they would disagree. A few weeks ago, my 3 kids, 8, 6, and 2, all got stung multiple times by an unprovoked and aggressive hive of bees, omitting bee erase to stop hate.
Love it, Kevin.
Now my kids don't want to go outside. How do I get them to get outside and over their new fear of nature?
Geez, this sounds like a tough one for qualified people. I would say, geez, man, I don't actually know the answer to this. Because I don't like using food as an incentive, but like sometimes you just got to do what you got to do to get kids to do stuff. So my large philosophical whatever about using food as an incentive probably goes out the door by the time you need to get stuff done. So whatever their favorite thing is, do it outside. I don't know what to do about the 2-year-old, but that's my take.
Yeah, there's plenty of stuff you can do to like help keep the bees out and like out and away. As far as like different candles or whatever, that would probably be your best option to just ensure. Make sure go out to a couple of places. Make sure there's no food involved that could possibly get them out to where you're at, and just try that for a little bit.
Yeah, and then also maybe like kind of a gradual thing. Like obviously make sure that you've got stuff to prevent bees from coming in, but like keeping doors open and letting the weather in or the windows open, and just kind of reducing the barrier in their minds between what is inside and what is outside for a little bit. Again, reassuring them that you've got bee safety kind of taken care of. I don't know. That's just a thought.
Yeah. A couple more of these and then we'll be done. Kevin Sayer asks, Dear Norse Code DN, am I a sadist in that I look forward to the pod more when we've lost, especially a really bad loss that looks like most of the players have never played together before?
I mean, the pod was kind of built off of a bad Vikings team, right? So it just kind of has more of its vibe when they're bad. So, yeah. I mean, the answer is yes, but I mean, we have conditioned you that way.
Yeah. Bishop Sycamore alumnus Ryan asks, is this the year Norse Code starts exclusively covering the Norse Code fantasy leagues and the corners instead of the Vikings?
Probably not. Also, are we 1-1 or did you win both games?
1-1. I won one game from you. You won the other because San Fran decided to bench the player that everybody had starting with running back.
Yeah, that's funny. Oh my God. Well, the Raheem Mostert got injured, right? So they're probably going to play your guy, right?
Yep, I don't have to change him from the spot. He'll be just fine. Damian Barrett says, drawn against James in the first week of fantasy and watching his QB, Rodgers, score -3 points, but yet I still trail to him owing to the plus 80 points he scored from his kickers. So there's not even really a question, but we have an experimental league. The guy who missed an extra point ended up, I think, winning his game. Like, this is insane. Yeah. I absolutely love it.
This league is nuts. So I had Lamar Jackson, who scored 3.5 points in this league, right? I also have Dustin Hopkins, who scored 75 points. I lost. and who I'm up against, Jesse, doesn't have anybody who scored more than 30 points except for the Pittsburgh defense with 41 points. Like, this league is crazy. Like, my approach to kicker was limit my downside because of all the possibilities for negatives, but I didn't realize, looking at the scoring, that kickers could score like 60, 70, 80 points.
Yep.
So I chose the complete wrong strategy for this game. Also, one of the kickers I drafted, because he wasn't going to kick that much, Matt Amendola, 2 M's, not related, scored exactly 0 points somehow.
The experimental league giveth, and the experimental league taketh away. I don't think that we're going to really understand the scoring system or how anything works in it until maybe week 5, and by then it's going to be too late. All of us will be dead. Let's go to Don from Ohio to finish this up here. He says, what was the main reason for so many checkdowns from Cousins? Offensive line not holding up, unable to extend his throwing motion due to the plexiglass constricting it, or the mask restricting his airflow, which in turn he couldn't generate enough power to throw deep?
I think it's the mask doesn't fit properly, and so it steams up his visor, which he doesn't have.
Yeah. Between that and the plexiglass, ouch.
Yeah.
And finally, for Reef's internet bullying corner.
Oh no.
I've recently had to deal with some rude people on Twitter due to my fair/honest comments about the Minnesota Golden Gophers. After the Ohio State University lost, complete fluke, I was bombarded by terribly mean comments from people on Twitter. I'm not the type to name names, but one of them rhymes with Tarek Thompson.
Very conscientious of you, Don, to omit the name.
Yes. My question for Reeve, you deal with these trolls on a daily basis. What is the best way to handle this?
So as an Ohio State fan, you are fairly close to the hypothetical Green Bay Packers fan version of a Reef that does not experience that many losses. So I can see why you don't know how to handle this. As a Gophers/Vikings fan, the answer is to strike first, and I don't mean at other people, I mean at yourself. Kind of like how Eminem does it in 8 Mile. Just put it all out there if they don't have any ammo.
And that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. And we'll be back later this week to talk about the matchup with Arizona. So before we leave, Reef, what do you have to plug?
At The Athletic, I'm going to have a piece up about the defensive line and how I thought they played as it relates to what they might need to get from them for the Arizona game. Other than that, it's just going to be I'm going to do a live Q&A on Thursday, I think at 1 p.m. Central. So that'll be at The Athletic. I mentioned that podcast with The Lead. So find that. I talk about some other games.
All right. Well, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. Again, we'll be back later this week. So for Reef, my name is James. And please remember, case cookus. And we will be back later this week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's official Vikings blog, at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. You can also find his written work at theathletic.com. I am your podcast host and producer, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or my personal account at BigMono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode or you can make a recurring monthly contribution by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. A donation of $3.50 per month does get you bonus material from the show and much more. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.